Have you ever been given the silent treatment? Of course you have. We've all been given the silent treatment, at least by somebody at some point in our lives. But how about this? Have you ever been given the silent treatment, only you didn't realize you were being given the silent treatment? When my wife Jamie and I were early on in our marriage, we had one of those knockout, no holds bar kinds of fights. Now, after 14 years, I don't even remember what the fight was about to begin with. But I do know after 14 years of marriage, I was probably in the wrong. Scratch that, I was definitely in the wrong, dear. The one thing I do remember about the fight, though, is that I didn't realize that we were even in a fight until we were well along into the battle. You see, in my opinion, fighting involves going toe-to-toe. Arguing, yelling, screaming, that's fighting. What I didn't realize 14 years ago is that there are other forms of fighting, more sophisticated fighting, more civilized fighting, a silent fight. So while there was a raging inferno building up in my wife Jamie, I was blissfully unaware that through her silence, she was trying to communicate with me that things were not all right, that there was a problem and I needed to fix them ASAP. Through Jamie's silence, she was speaking volumes to me. Well, 3,000 years ago, there was another married couple who was going through a similar argument. The spouse on her part had messed up big time. In fact, this wasn't even the first time she had messed up in the marriage. She was blissfully unaware that there was a problem. The husband, being patient, endured and endured, but then eventually started to give his wife the silent treatment. Do you know the couple that I'm talking about? I'm talking about the marriage between God and Israel. God, on his part, had been a faithful, loving, and providing husband for his wife Israel. But on her part, well, Israel had been less than faithful. She'd been hot and cold in her affections, and to be honest, she'd been utterly selfish throughout the whole relationship. What we're told in the Old Testament is that the fighting only seemed to grow worse and worse as the years went on. By the time we get to the book of Judges, we're told that everyone did what was right in his or her own eyes. And then by the time we get to the book of 1 Samuel, we see that even the priests of God, were morally corrupt and had abandoned their relationship. We see that everyone had abandoned their relationship with God. Can you imagine the frustration that God felt in all of this? The hurt, the pain? I mean, here was God. He loved Israel. He had rescued her. He had cared for her, provided for her, gave her a home. And what does she do? She grieved him over and over again. So it makes sense to me that when we get to 1 Samuel 3, which we just read this morning, we find that the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Well, of course it was rare. God was giving Israel the silent treatment, but not out of spite, not out of anger or to get even, but he was trying to get her attention. Just like Jamie was trying to get my attention through the silent treatment, God was trying to get Israel's attention through his silence. He was trying to tell them things were not all right. They needed to fix things ASAP, and that they needed to start to listen up. Well, you know something? I don't think Israel is the only one to whom God has given the silent treatment before. In fact, I very much believe that God uses silence to communicate with us today. Maybe it's because we have some sin in our lives, like Israel, and God's trying to tell us that we need to fix this in order to have a right relationship again. But maybe it's not so deviant. Maybe it's because we're distracted and God is trying to gain our attention because he has something important to tell us. Or maybe It's because God wants to grow our faith. And so he goes silent and whispers. And that forces us to lean in. You know, when you whisper to someone, they lean closer. And when God goes silent, we lean into him. I don't know why God goes silent on us from time to time, but I do know one thing, that when we feel that God has gone silent and that he's giving us the silent treatment, he is actually still communicating with us. He is actually trying to grab our attention. The question is, are we willing to listen, even in the midst of the silence? Are we willing to listen to God when it feels like he's not saying anything? Now, I know a lot of people, when they feel that God's giving them the silent treatment, they grow frustrated and angry. And I've known lots of people who have just walked away from the faith because they felt like God had either abandoned them or was just done talking, and then so they just leave. But if we learn to listen, the truth is we will hear something from God in the silence, that God will eventually break his silence and share his life-transforming, powerful word for us. Oftentimes, he uses the silence to get our attention, because oftentimes, when he goes silent, he has something very important to tell us. God certainly had something important to tell the prophet Samuel in 1 Samuel 3. And what we see is God first started speaking through silence. Samuel just needed to learn to listen to God, even in the midst of the silence. So immediately after we're told that the word of the Lord had grown rare in the days of Samuel, the scene fades up. And we're told in chapter 3 that Eli, the high priest, and a young Samuel, probably about an adolescent's age, were asleep in the tent of meeting. And it was the middle of the night. And we know it's the middle of the night because we're told that the lamp of God had not gone out yet. Now, a lot of ink and theories have been spilt and spread on what exactly is the lamp of God. It's very simple. The lamp of God is nothing more than a priest's nightlight. I know, isn't that crazy? The lamp of God, a priest's nightlight. But it's not because they were scared of the dark or anything. It actually had a very practical purpose. So these guys were asleep in the tent of meeting. You know what else was housed in the tent of meeting? The Ark of the Covenant. So imagine you're a priest and it's the middle of the night and you get up to go to the bathroom and you're trying to find your way around, and then suddenly you trip over the Ark of the Covenant. Well, suddenly you have a bigger problem on your hands other than a full bladder. You're one dead priest because you're not supposed to ever touch the Ark of the Covenant. So they have this little lamp that would burn enough oil through the night. And when we're told that the lamp of God had not gone out yet, that means it's not morning, it's the middle of the night. And there was Eli and Samuel fast asleep. And silence was in the air, just like the silence that God had been giving Israel. That is, until the silence was suddenly broken, and there was a whisper in the air. Samuel. Samuel. Now, Samuel must be a light sleeper. I can sleep through a hurricane, so it would have to be a yell for me to wake up. But immediately, the young Samuel wakes up. Now, there's nobody else in the tent except for one other person. It's Eli. So he naturally does the right thing. He goes over to old man Eli and he shakes him out of his sleep. And he's like, Eli, you called for me. What do you want? And poor Eli, he's like thinking, man, I am like halfway through my Ambien pill and this kid is waking me up. What do you need? He's like, no, you called me. No, Samuel, I didn't call you. You're having dreams. You're hearing things. Go back to bed, kid. So Samuel, a little confused on his part, went back to bed, probably thinking, well, I know I heard something, but maybe I was dreaming. Never mind, it doesn't matter. And he just went back to bed. But before too long, as he was lying there, probably not in a deep sleep, he heard the whisper again. Samuel. Samuel. Now this time he wasn't in a deep sleep, so he knows what he heard. He knew his name was being called. And there's nobody else in the room, so it's got to be Eli. And he runs back over to the old man and wakes him up again. Now I feel bad for Eli at this point. Any of you parents out there who have ever tried to have a good night's rest only to have some kid, your kid, wake you up in the middle of the night over and over again, knows the pain and struggle. I kid you not. Last night, I did not plan this in my sermon. Last night, I was woken up by my children 3 times. I'm exhausted. So poor man Eli, I feel the pain, and I don't know how he kept his cool. I didn't keep my cool last night, to be honest. I'm not going to recall the events. It's not priestly or Christian even. But Eli keeps his cool, and he looks at Samuel and he goes, "Kid, it's not me. Go back to bed. You're hearing things." Well, at this point in verse 7, we learn something interesting. We get a little bit of an explanation as to what's going on, why Samuel is confused. And it says, Samuel didn't recognize that it was God calling for him because he did not know that it was the Lord and that the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. So it explains he doesn't know God because he didn't know God, so he didn't recognize God. But that opens up a whole other set of questions. I mean, okay, no, wait a second. So Samuel doesn't know God, so he doesn't recognize God. But wait a second, wasn't Samuel studying under the high priest Eli? Didn't his mother dedicate his whole life to God's service? I mean, here's basically this junior priest in training serving at the tent of meeting, and yet he doesn't know God? How has he avoided knowing about God at this point? That doesn't make any sense. Unless to know God means something more like to know him personally. Not know about him, but to know him in a relationship. For example, thanks to BBC and Netflix, I know a lot about the royal family. I can tell you details about each member of the family, yet I've never met the royal family. Fun fact, Jamie and I, in our last trip to England, almost met the royal family at the opening of Parliament, but we were about 50 yards away. So that's the closest I've ever been to the Queen of England. I wouldn't have a clue what her voice sounds like other than what I've heard on TV. In fact, actors and actresses probably now sound more like the royal family than the actual royal family. So I don't personally know them. I know a lot of details about them, but I don't personally know them. So I wouldn't quite recognize them. And so maybe that's what's going on. Samuel just simply didn't have a personal relationship with the Lord, and so he didn't recognize when God was calling out to him. He didn't recognize the tone, the cadence. He didn't recognize the voice. But then that begs the question, how is it that someone who works in ministry doesn't know the Lord personally? How is it that this junior priest doesn't have a relationship with God? Well, honestly, history is full of people who have worked in the church but don't personally know the Lord. Famous ministers, Martin Luther, John Wesley, even the former dean of St. Philip's in Atlanta worked as a priest. Father David Collins worked as a priest before he actually came to a relationship, a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. Lots of people can work for the church, but that doesn't mean they necessarily have a personal relationship with God. Lots of us can go to church, do Christian things, know a lot about God, attend every one of Alfred's Bible studies and Ken's Sunday school classes, but not personally know the Lord. Samuel knew a lot about God, but he did not know him. And if we don't personally know him, then we won't be able to recognize his voice either. Maybe that's why some of us feel like God has gone silent. It's not that God's gone silent. We just don't recognize his voice anymore in our lives. In Dallas Willard's book, Hearing God, he says that the key to being sure that God is speaking to you is to focus on building a relationship with him. Willard explains that God talks to people through all sorts of facets, but that the only way we'll be able to recognize his voice from, say, our own inner thoughts or mere coincidence and circumstances is to spend time actually getting to know him, learning his voice, learning how he interacts with us. Well, once again, Samuel went back to bed, bewildered as to what in the world was going on. And I'm sure at this point he's hardly asleep. And suddenly it happened again. The voice calls out, "Samuel, Samuel." The poor kid's probably thinking, either Eli's losing it or he's playing a trick on me. Either way, I'm going to go see what's going on. So once again, he goes and he wakes up Eli. Poor Eli. But Eli, again, keeps his cool. Only this time, Eli figures out what's going on. He recognizes that it was the Lord working, that it was God calling out to him. And he says to Samuel, "Samuel, come here, I got to tell you something. The next time you hear this voice call out to you, here's what I want you to do. Simply say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" Do you got that, Samuel? Yeah, I got that. No, repeat it back to me. "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Very good. Okay. And Samuel? Yes, Eli? Don't wake me up again. So once again, Samuel goes back to bed, this time prepared to listen. You see, Samuel had been hearing God's voice, but he hadn't been listening to God's voice. And after 14 years of marriage, I can say I've also learned that there's a big difference between hearing and truly listening. So Samuel goes back to his bed. I'm sure at this point he's just wide awake, really can't fall back to sleep. And he is intently listening now into the silence, waiting for something to happen. His focus and his attention is not on himself, not on his sleep, but on the silence. And then suddenly, it happens again. "Samuel, Samuel." But this time, it was even louder. This time, it was as if God were actually in the room with him. And Samuel responded as instructed. He said, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And boy, did God speak to Samuel. It was powerful. It was transformative. It was life-changing. From that point on, Samuel was no longer Samuel, the young junior prophet or priest. He was now Samuel, the priest and prophet. He could hear God. He could talk to God. He was transformed by the powerful word of God. And it all started by listening to the silence. We're told from that point on, Samuel grew and grew in the Lord. And because he could hear the word of the Lord, his words never fell on deaf ears. People listened now to Samuel. Have you ever experienced God's silence in your life? Do you feel like you're experiencing that silence right now? When I was 21, I thought I was going to be the music industry's next big music producer. I was a DJ. I was learning sound engineering. I was working on a guaranteed double platinum hip-hop album. I kid you not. I knew this thing was going double platinum. And the thing is, I was actually doing it all for the Lord. I was using my music to share the gospel. So I was doing this all for a good cause, a good reason. It was a ministry to me. But then one morning, when I was supposed to head out to Cleveland to go to a recording studio to meet a group of people to record an album, I woke up and my hearing in my right ear was gone. Everything had gone silent. I panicked. I got nervous. I immediately went to an ears, nose, and throat specialist. And I found out that Sudden hearing loss is common in about 1 in 10,000 people. They don't know the cause. They think it's a virus. And unfortunately for a lot of folks, it's irreversible. My world went silent. Everything felt like it was falling apart. It was very hard as a young guy to lose your hearing in one ear. I fasted music. I fasted food. I fasted anything I could to convince God to give me my hearing back. But it never came. I'm still deaf in my right ear. It came back a little, but for the most part, my hearing, if you stick your finger in your ear, which I wouldn't recommend, it's probably not the cleanliest thing to do, or if you put a earplug in your ear, that's about how well I hear out of my right ear. I was cast into silence. I got angry. I shut God out at times. But eventually I conceded that my hearing was gone, along with my hopes of breaking it into the music industry. And eventually I accepted that God was going to do something good through this, that He had a purpose for the silence. Now, I wish I could tell you that I had some grand, miraculous event like Samuel, where God revealed to me all that He was doing. But I don't. Instead, the silence has stuck with me, and I've had to learn to listen in that silence. And through multiple conversations, through many years, I've learned a lot through the silence that God has given me. I learned that God was using the silence to gain my attention. In fact, as I look back now, I see how God was trying to get my attention for a long time. And it was only when silence entered into my life that I finally was giving God my attention and would allow Him to speak. And it was through that silence that I found out what God was trying to say to me. And He was trying to say very clearly, Chase, I have other plans for your life. The music industry, man, that sounds great now. But you're 21. I've got something that you're going to love your entire life. And boy, was He right. I mean, at 21, music is great. Going out and DJing is wonderful. But at 35, almost 36, I can't even stay up past 10 o'clock. And that's when most nights were beginning for me. God had bigger plans for my life. And if it hadn't been for God communicating to me through the silence, well, I wouldn't be here right now. I've learned that the silence that I once considered to be a curse, I now count as a blessing. Perhaps God has gone silent on you. I hope the one thing that you learn from 1 Samuel and from my own experience is that that doesn't mean that God's abandoned you or that He's not even communicating with you anymore. In fact, it probably means He is very much trying to get your attention to tell you something. We just need to learn to listen, to be patient and listen even in the midst of the silence, like Samuel. Because the truth is, when God goes silent and we learn to listen, God has an important word to share with us. And when He shares that word, it will be powerful. It'll be life-giving. It will be transformative. I want to encourage us all to listen to God, even if it feels like He's gone silent on us, and allow our attention to be focused on Him so that He can give us that transformative, powerful word that we desperately need. Amen.